I'll try that again. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the First Steps in Thesis Writing webinar with Desmond Thomas. First of all, I'd just like you to note that this is an interactive workshop, so you might want to have your PhD ideas to mind and perhaps also a pen and paper. And also just some practicalities. So all your microphones are muted, as this creates a better sound quality. However, Desmond's made very clear that your questions and comments are welcome. And if you'd like to leave them in the questions or chat box, the times throughout the webinar where Desmond will be able to answer them for you. And also, if you don't have the time to listen to the whole webinar, or at the end you'd like to go back and listen again, we'll be sending out an automatic recording of the webinar. So now I'm going to hand over to Desmond.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me all right? That's all right, I think. Okay. So we started the broadcast, have we? I assume we have.
Right,
good morning,
Desmond.
everybody.
Yeah.
We started, have we? Just checking. Can we begin?
Yes, we have.
Excellent. All right. Good morning, everybody. My name is Desmond Thomas, and I hope you can hear me loud and clear. I mean, if you can't, please put it down under the chat feed or put it down as a question. We hope that the sound quality and the picture quality are excellent. If not, you'll be able to have access to a recording, it seems. I've been working for the past 15 years with PhD students, and I've become more and more, I've become interested in supporting PhD students in their writing. You can see the kind of courses I've been doing here. Been working in the UK. Before that, I was working in different countries at different universities. What I've discovered at this time is that most doctoral level writers really like doing their research, but when it comes to writing, it's another question. People tend to put off writing. They tend to procrastinate, and people believe that writing is hard, but they also believe that this is their problem. They're the only ones to have this problem. And this is quite serious, because if you're thinking about an academic career, writing is an integral part of any academic career. I've talked to experienced professors who have published a lot, and they have told me that it takes a long time before they actually begin to enjoy writing. But it does happen, believe it or not. Writing is a set of skills. You're not born as a writer. The other things I've discovered is that there are a lot of myths attached to writing, and this is the biggest one. This myth says that you're sitting in your garret and you suddenly get inspiration and writing just appears. It's a result of thinking. You read, you get ideas, the ideas float around in your head, and then suddenly you can start writing. And I think this is a real problem. I think closer to the truth is something like this, that writing is in fact either a product of your thinking and also a form of thinking in itself. So as you write, once you get your ideas down on paper, this will help you to think more clearly, will feed back into your reading, which then feeds back into writing again. So this is how I would describe the process. It's a kind of messy, non-linear process. And a related problem is that thinking is not static. One certainty is that over a 3 or 4 year period, your thinking is definitely going to change. So you need to ask yourself, how am I going to keep track of my thinking as a result of what I read? Every time you read something, your ideas change. Every time you talk to other people, your ideas may change. It's extremely important to keep track of this. So these are the sort of questions we're going to be looking at in this webinar to help you begin the process of planning and writing your doctoral thesis. And I'm going to be referring to the PhD Writing Handbook, which I've got a copy here. First of all, I would just like to ask you, do a quick poll. you're in the early stages of PhD writing. What are the things that worry you? We've got 5 options here. I've got another 5 options in the next poll. So is it 1, is it 2, is it 3, is it 4, is it 5? Which of these things concern you most? Let's have a look and see what people say. If you could just enter the poll section and see how we get on. A lot of people answering here. At the moment, it looks like a lot of people are saying producing a good quality literature review, but it's going up, and also the sheer volume of material. It seems that all of those things are more or less equal, but people are worried about the literature review. Given that, I have some slides on the literature review, so I'll make sure I include them later. Actually, literature review is winning easily. So let's close that down. And let's start another poll, if we may. This next poll, once again, which of these things concern you most? And here we have a sort of mix of things. Formulating research questions, not having enough background knowledge. This is a huge worry for many people. Producing a text that's structured and coherent, communicating with supervisors, or English language difficulties, which some people blame for all of their troubles. But I'm interested to see that that is not a problem for most people. And I think that's right. So we're getting the first 3, in particular, producing a structured and coherent text. That's very interesting, actually. So the first 3 of those are getting a lot of answers. We'll do some more polls as we go along. But your long-term worries may be a little bit more profound. Everyone worries about getting lost. Everyone worries about the time. And there's more and more pressure on us than ever before these days. We have to finish between 3 or 4 years. But there are more fundamental things as well, such as the last one. Deep down, we all fear that we're not good enough, that on the day that we hand in our PhD thesis, someone else is going to hand in something better, or a book will be produced that we should have referred to and haven't. So I'm going to try and talk at the end of this little presentation about the more psychological aspects of what we do, because people don't give up because they run out of time generally. They give up because they feel it's not worthwhile to continue. And these are the kind of questions we will be looking at. I think you've seen these already because we put them in the invitation. We're going to look at the early stages of thesis writing. Question 2, the answer is now, as we'll see. Breaking down a topic area and looking at some effective strategies for reading that will feed into a literature review. And at the very end, I want to say a few words about motivation. Just try a little poll first to find out who you are, because unfortunately there's rather a lot of you. I'd just like to know where you're coming from. Wow, it seems a huge domination of UK, Western Europe, Central and Eastern Europe, but we have some representatives from all of the others. That's interesting. So we are very Eurocentric in our audience today, but there's a few for all, except Australasia isn't particularly well represented. And I also want to know the stage of your research that you've reached. See if that one can come up. That needs to close. So I'd like to know if you're about to begin, or if you're just starting doctoral study, or if you're at the end of your first year. We have a sizable number of 2nd, 3rd and 4th year students. That's very interesting. This is what I tend to get on my courses as well. On my courses, I tend to get people who are going back thinking about writing, and perhaps they should have been thinking about it a lot earlier, but it's never too late. So that is very interesting. The majority is for the early weeks or months of doctoral study, but we have about 50% in 2nd, 3rd or 4th year. And one final poll before we really get started. Just want to know, what's your rough disciplinary area? Are you in the natural sciences? Are you in social sciences, arts, humanities, Or is it a mix, or is it a crossover? And we've got a great majority down for social sciences. That's very interesting once again. Okay, thank you very much for that. Before we move on and we start talking about developing a research topic, are there any questions, any urgent questions that you'd like me to deal with? I can see questions about sound quality from Katrina. I hope that's a lot better now. Let me just see, anything else? There, Eleanor, if you see some questions I haven't spotted, please do draw them to my attention. Just one moment. That's better. Any other questions there? I can't see any for the moment, so I will move on. The first question about writing is, when do you begin writing? And I make quite clear in the book that I think writing should start as soon as possible. And I'm not talking about chapter writing. When people think about writing, they tend to think about producing PhD chapters. But from this extract from the book, this is from page 6, chapter 1 of the book, you can see that there are a lot of writing tasks right at the very beginning. I have attached a handout to this talk, so you will be able to see a more updated version of this. And the handout is entitled, let me just find it on my screen, The Stages of Doctoral Research Writing. And I am
so everyone, sorry, Desmond.
That's okay.
I just want to make clear that you'll find that handout at the end of the PDF that I've attached to the webinar, if anyone's looking for that.
That's very good. I hope they can find it all right.
Yeah, do let us know in the comments if you're struggling to find that handout.
By the way, Eleanor, I'm having some problems seeing myself on camera. My picture keeps disappearing. So if my head disappears from the screen, I apologize to everybody. But we'll move on anyway. I want to talk a little bit about what is perhaps our first task, and which is breaking down and developing the research topic. This is where reading and writing both begin. And our task is to find not a topic that's going to change the world. It's got to be something that's manageable, feasible, doable. It's got to be something that's very specific. We can't ask ourselves a series of vague questions. And above all, it's got to be a topic that is meaningful to a community of readers, to the readers in our field. And those become progressively more difficult as we go along. The feasibility, there are some obvious criteria. You've got to break down your topic in terms of size. You've got to have the resources, and you need the skills. I mean, I've known people that set out to do a research project and they had to learn a new language to do it, and it just made it not very feasible. Got to make sure the data is accessible, and there are some more subtle ones as well. I mean, you've got to think about risk, and risk levels come in a whole range of categories. I mean, there's physical risk. I mean, you may put in danger the people you're talking to if the topic is a very sensitive one. Or it may just be that the topic goes out of date, or that it changes as you are doing the research. The topic is so fluid, it disappears from your hands and it ends up being something completely different. And even things like distance, and I don't mean geographical distance, I mean your ability to distance yourself psychologically from the topic, and to separate yourself from the topic and treat it in as objective a way as possible. For the ethical principles, we don't need to go over those. Those are the things that you know, and you'll be made aware of those very, very much by your supervisors and the people who are in charge of approving your research project. So we won't dwell on those. But in my courses, I often give my students little feasibility tasks. And sometimes the topic looks perfectly okay. But the more you look at it, the more you realize that it's got to be qualified in some way. Have a look at this one. What impact is the land reform policy in Zimbabwe having on the local economy? If you've got a topic that looks like that, there's the problem, first of all, of where you're going to get the data from. I mean, there's no question that it might be hard to get people to answer that question without giving you a very biased set of responses. But also, impact is not clear. What type of impact? Local economy, not entirely clear. And above all, you're looking at something which hasn't ended. You're looking at a kind of ongoing phenomenon. So this might be more feasible. The economic impact of the land reform policy from 1980 to 1999. Once you set it in time, it becomes a bit more manageable. Once you start trying to define your key terms, such as impact, it becomes more feasible. I think also at this stage, it's probably better to consider a topic or a title rather than a question. It's too soon to look for a big question. You'll find your big question as a result of reading and writing. Possibly it will take you a year. So personally, I prefer this kind of format. And once I've got that, I have to think about how I'm going to start pulling this topic in different directions. My aim is to find out which is the most fruitful direction, which is the one that's going to generate the big question for me. So this is called breaking down a topic laterally. And I think as researchers, we do need to be lateral thinkers. It's no good just thinking in a linear way. We can't keep it all in our head. And our aim is to find a direction which is the right one for us. And that means considering all the possible directions that we can, not just going for the very, very first question. So here's a topic that is dear to my heart. I lived for many years in Bulgaria. I was an educational specialist, so I'm interested in changes to the education system, and I'm interested in a particular period. So what's that going to generate? Well, it can generate lots of different things. You know, I can look at 1989 was a big date. This is when the Berlin Wall came down and communism ended in Eastern and Central Europe. So what were the influences of socialism, communism on the education system? Or I might break it down according to subject areas. I might very fruitfully try to unpack the idea of reform. This is a big task in our reading and writing in the early stages of PhD research. So the World Bank gave Bulgaria a lot of money at that time, but is their understanding of reform the same as everybody else's understanding? They might have had a very clear agenda that the Bulgarian government did not. So what are the different understandings of reform? A really interesting question is what happened before socialism, communism? So were there traditions that might have returned? And what happened afterwards? Post-1989 influences, effects on different groups of teachers, and so on. So you can see that when we got this kind of mind map, when we got this kind of diagram, we're beginning to look at the possible ways in which we can break down our topic. And then the next stage is to think about possible research questions. So looking at all of these different lines, each of them can generate straightforward questions. You know, what's understood by reform? Is it seen as beneficial? What are the main influences of socialism? What kind of educational traditions were there? And so on. But what's really interesting with a diagram like this is that we don't need to go just in one area. We can look across the diagram and we can connect different areas of the diagram with more interesting questions. So then you get something like this. You know, you're connecting ideas of reform and post-communist government attitudes, or you're connecting ideas of reform as a reaction to socialism, communism. And most interesting of all, you know, you're questioning the whole idea that reform has taken place. Is it a case that the country has just gone back to educational traditions that preceded this? So that's the idea, that you need to start writing down ideas, you need to start generating questions, And from all of these might come a big one. So I hope this is something to take away. I think one advantage of this is that you consider the possibilities before you tie yourself to something which you may regret after 1 year. There's nothing worse than after 1 year saying to your supervisor, I want to change my topic. The way to preempt this is to think and to read round the possible topics. And once you fill in this diagram, I think it's quite a useful mediation document with supervisors. Sometimes conversations with supervisors can be a little bit circular, but when you've got something concrete to focus on, supervisors are very good at saying this direction looks more fruitful, I wouldn't bother with this, that direction, it's already been done. So I do recommend doing this, and you will find this in the PhD Writing Handbook in chapter 2, and there's a sort of template you can look at and further explanations of how to go about this. It's a really useful exercise for research questions, and also in a later chapter we talk about doing this for unpacking key concepts within your research. And out of this you might find a possible big question. So is secondary education in Bulgaria undergoing a process of reform, or is it returning to its traditional roots? That's an interesting question. If no one has asked it before, maybe you can be the person to ask it. I think it's quite an interesting one. But finding the big question, what we're doing there is number 3 on our list. We're brainstorming the topic, we're writing down ideas, we're generating multiple questions. But there are other ways as well. For example, number 1, talking to others, giving presentations. I very much believe that research in progress presentations are an excellent way to get you thinking and to clarify your thinking about your research project. And above all, reading. Why do we read? Well, we're going to be talking about it in a minute. But above all, we're looking for gaps. We're looking for contradictions, inconsistencies, things which don't quite make sense. Now, if it's a huge gap and a huge hole, we don't want to fall down in it and never reappear. But if it's something which really, really needs to be explained, then maybe we will be the people to do it. Okay, I'm going to stop for a minute, and I'm going to ask Eleanor to help me with the questions, because questions are not coming up on my screen. So Eleanor, if you can see anyone asking a question that could be addressed now, something referring to what I've been saying or referring to reading. Can you hear me all right, Eleanor?
Yes, I can. Yeah, I can't see any questions at the moment. I've got a comment from someone saying they're having problems with the question feed. If you are struggling to ask a question, then please write it in the chat box and we'll be able to see it there.
Okay, I'll have a look in the chat box. Yeah, because I'm having problems with both at the moment, but no doubt. I'll put in a hello in the chat box and see if you can see it. I'll put in hello, everyone. Otherwise, it's just me talking to myself. Can people see that, entire audience? Can you see my hello, everyone? Because we can use the chat box for this if the questions are not working that well.
I'm seeing lots of yeses.
Yeah?
I'm seeing lots of yeses.
Lots of yeses, okay. I can't see any, unfortunately. I don't know why. So you'll have to be my interpreter and pass them on to me. I can only see what I've written. Pity. Never mind. But if you've got a burning question or a comment, we'd like to flag it up, because we would like to make this interactive if we possibly can. Otherwise, it's just me talking to myself.
I've just seen one. Sorry, Desmond, I've just seen one question. It says, your idea about writing questions using a mind map is interesting. Could you give us another example, please?
You mean example in terms of topic? I suppose the best thing to do is to have a look in the book, because in chapter 2 of the book, Developing a Research Topic Through Writing, we do go into great detail on this. But basically, you've got to try it out with your own topic. And you've got to play around with your topic until you're satisfied that one aspect of the topic is leading you in the direction in which you want to go. But the whole reason for doing this is that researchers really do need to think laterally. And too often we think in a very linear direction, and we don't see a really fascinating topic which is just outside our grasp, which if only we could see it, we would say, yes, that is for us. So it's trying to look at all the possibilities before actually narrowing ourselves to one and saying, that's what I want to do. Because if we narrow ourselves too early, if we break down the topic too early, we may make the decision that's wrong for us and doesn't satisfy the significance criteria as well as it might. So I hope that's a kind of answer to your question. I mean, I could give many, many examples of this. On the handout, by the way, are my contact details. So if people would like to contact me with questions, I'll be very happy to receive emails, and I'll try to reply to all of them. But you will, at the bottom of your handout, find a couple of email addresses for me. Okay?
I've just got another question here.
Sure.
It says, could those questions that were generated laterally be ones that the PhD also addresses, or are they meant to generate the big research questions?
It could be either, really. I mean, as you find more and more questions, you will see, that's something I really want to answer. And if the question is a very detailed one, it might feed into a survey which you design later. But certainly one of the purposes is to find the underlying, the fundamental question that you're trying to answer. Why am I doing this? What is it that I want to know? And you won't be able to answer that question immediately. It will take some time before you can do that. But eventually, you need to have the answer to this. If you've reached the end of your project and you can't really answer that question, then it's going to be harder to defend your project in the Viva. But there's a huge advantage in generating lots of questions. Some of them may be completely useless and completely silly, but when you see the range of questions that you think are relevant to your topic, some of them may be at a very detailed level, and they can feed into surveys, they can feed into interviews, and so on. Okay?
Okay, I think we should probably plough on for now, but we do have some time for more questions at the end. So if you were waiting for a question to be answered there, just keep it in your mind, and I'm sure Desmond will be able to answer it for you later, or as he said, you are able to contact him.
Okay. I can now see myself on the screen, which is hugely advantageous. I'm not kind of talking into a vacuum. So we'll move on. I want to say a little bit about reading, because I think reading is certainly the key to writing, and we read in order to write. And reading begins when your supervisor first meets you and says, go away and start reading. And that's a very sensible thing to say. It may seem frustrating because it's not very helpful. But you do at first need to do a certain amount of exploratory reading around your topic to find out what's out there. And this hopefully will not only help to clarify your thinking. You may think it's muddling you, but eventually it will help to clarify your thinking. But it will help you to both generate the kind of questions that you need, and also to consider the problematic concepts which you may be taking for granted. And we saw things like impact in the previous example, or reform in my own example. You have to be absolutely certain what people mean by these. And when you use a term like this, you have to be certain that the reader will understand it in the same way. So unpacking these concepts is a very important aim of reading at this stage. And then later on, once you have engaged in the parallel process of developing your topic, you will be able to test out your claims, look at your questions and see if other people have asked the same questions. You'll be able to collect evidence to support your ideas. You'll be able to look at counterclaims. So once you've gone further down the lane, once you've gone further down the line of topic development, then you'll be able to read in a much more focused way. But at first, you need to be reading in a kind of exploratory mode. And this has its problems. These are the main issues related to reading. And I put the ones which bother me the most in red. And those are the ones we need to talk about, because people often worry about taking notes. But you also need a system for looking at texts and for categorizing text. And to my surprise, I discover that most people don't have that. In fact, at its worst, people will treat every single text in exactly the same way, and they'll treat every paragraph of every text in the same way, and every sentence of every paragraph. And you can't do this. You've got to have a system or a set of criteria which will enable you to evaluate text so you can get the most out of them. Not every text is going to be useful to you. This is my system. It's not the only one at all, but in the book, in chapter 3 of the PhD Writing Handbook, I talk about this at length, because I feel that this is what's lacking and why people end up reading in exploratory mode for years and years, and you actually can't do this. Sorry, we've gone backwards again. There we are. There's my system for selecting text. At the top of the list, you've got seminal texts, and these are texts you can't ignore. This is by the big author in the field, and maybe it's not so relevant, but you need to acknowledge it just to find out that the big authors in the field have something to say. But they're probably not going to be the most useful texts. The second category, important or key texts, these are the ones you need to separate, because these are the ones that merit an intensive reading. So every sentence may be important, every section. But most texts that you will come across will not fall into this category, or will not fall into this category immediately. So for example, I find that when I'm reading text for a piece of research, that most texts are useful in terms of number 4. There might be one idea, one quotation, one example, and I might have a few useful texts, number 3. I'll have a lot of possible and impossible texts, but very, very few key or important texts. Now, you have to be careful here, because this system is fluid. You look at a text and say, this is complete rubbish, or this is completely irrelevant, it's impossible. But before throwing it in the bin, or getting rid of it, or banishing it from your site, you do need to keep a record and say, okay, on this day I read this text and I don't think it's very useful. Because as we've said before, your thinking over time will change. And maybe that impossible text will become a possible text that you've noted down as possibly useful, and it may even become a key text. And I speak to you as someone who's made this mistake and couldn't find texts which I was looking for. This was in the pre-digital age, of course, when I did my own PhD, but there's nothing more annoying than throwing away a text and then later realizing that it's useful. The second most annoying thing is reading a text and thinking, well, this is familiar, and realizing that you read it all a year before and you kept no record of having read it. So you do need to look at texts in this kind of light. You do need to have some sort of categorization system so that you can immediately say, yes, this text is going to be really important for my research, or maybe one item is useful, or maybe possibly this will be useful. And then your system, of course, may change as your thinking changes. And if you do that, you're beginning to do something which I think is really, really important. And that is leaving your dirty footprints over everything that you read. And these are ways of leaving your dirty footprints. You can just record references, you can summarize, you can highlight quotations, or you can do something a little more responsive, such as query claims or compare the text, or write some analytical notes that we'll come to in a minute. The point of this is that when you read a text, you should consider its usefulness, but you should also mark it so that if you need to return, you'll immediately have an entry point. You'll say, ah, yes, I've got my notes, I remember this text, and hopefully those will be analytical notes, because this is where writing really begins. You also need things like a monthly plan, a weekly schedule, which I'll come back to. But more important is this idea of the different ways in which you approach reading. And I would suggest that we spend a lot of time doing number one, and we can end up summarizing people's ideas and not taking it much further. But the real writing task at this stage is to find texts which are important or key texts and respond to those ideas, explore the writer's agenda. What's going on? Why does this person hold these views? Above all, consider the validity of what the person is saying. The question you need to ask yourself when you're reading a key text is, am I convinced? Am I partially convinced? Am I totally convinced? Am I unconvinced? Why not? And start writing to yourself the reasons why, because critical note-taking is a very, very important writing task at this stage. And if you're lucky and follow this kind of sequence, you'll start by highlighting things which look interesting. You'll then annotate the text with your own comments, and even a question mark is more useful than just summarizing someone's ideas. And you may draw conclusions from these comments, and then you may prepare a different type of summary. Rather than summarizing what the person has said, summarizing your own notes in response to what this person is saying and how it relates to what other people are saying, and above all, how it relates to how you yourself feel at this particular stage in your thinking. This is how your thinking develops, and this is how your writing develops in tandem as you read more. So I think it's vital to do this. I think this kind of written analysis, whether it ends up as a book review or whether it ends up as an important section in a literature review or another chapter, this is how we build analysis and how we build decent literature reviews. So the two things in reading which I think are most important are distinguishing between different types of text and keeping an open mind on this, and then making sure that when you read, you write. When I did a PhD, I can remember reading 20 articles, writing 20 summaries, and then I thought, and now what? And worse than that is that summarizing someone's ideas can be a very dangerous thing. Once you remove ideas from the original, you can distort what someone is saying and actually misinterpret what they're saying. So we need to stick to original text, and we need to have our comments on the original text, and then we need to summarize those comments. And then we have a very important route into actual chapter writing, and certainly into literature review writing. Any thoughts on that? I mean, I've kind of raced through that because we don't have so much time, but if you've got any thoughts or questions you'd like to ask about that, please do. Do it through Eleanor. Eleanor, anything you want to pass on here?
Let's have a look. Somebody's asking if you could elaborate a bit more on point 4 of critical note-taking skills.
I'll go back. Just one moment. Yes, in certain disciplines, such as sociology and anthropology, it's very important to collect together what are called memos, sort of based on your analysis of data. So you look at data and you write the comments about the data and you pull it together and you summarize those comments and you build your writing up like this. I feel we can do this in any field, really, when doing a literature review. That rather than writing a summary of this person says A, B, C, D, E, we write a summary of our responses to the person saying A, B, C, D. This will be a much more interesting piece of writing because our voice will be there. And one of the problems in writing a very long text is that our voice can disappear. A key element of a literature review is that we need to be there. So in order to help this happen, this is one way in which we can link reading another person's work to writing where our own voice is strong. So that's what I mean. I just mean writing lots of comments and trying to put those comments together and summarize them and putting them into some kind of reasoned argument, which may be praising the writer, or may be very similar to the writer, or may be very dissimilar, depending on our response. I hope that's okay. Anything else we need to talk about?
So I've noticed a couple of comments about the best way to record references.
The best way to record references. Well, I'm not going to go down the route of talking about referencing systems, because if you go on something like EndNote, you'll discover there's well over 150. But one thing I will say is that when you do a bibliography, I think it's very, very useful not just to put the basic reference, but to do an annotated bibliography for your own purposes. At the end of your work, there'll be a straightforward bibliography. But when you're doing your references, if you can write down why it's useful to you, why you think, what particular purpose it will have within your PhD thesis, this is immensely useful when you're trying to put together chapters at a later stage. So the reference can give you a clue, but the reference plus your own comments as to why it's relevant, whether it's a key text, whether it's a one single item text, or what, that's, I think, a very useful practice.
Okay, and one more.
Sure.
I've got a question about what order to write in. Should we write in particular order? Is it important to just write about different topics at the same time, or stick to one of our questions?
I think it depends on the kind of work you're doing. You know, this is a particularly difficult question to answer when you're reporting your data later on. And the order in which you write things may have very, very sort of big consequences for the rest of your work. But generally, we have the order of a narrative in which we're telling a story. But a lot of what we do isn't a story. A lot of what we do is analysis. So we have to build that into the story some way. With a literature review, I'll give you some ideas in a minute on how we might structure that so that it does tell a story. Shall we go on to the literature review then? Because that may answer that question a little bit better. Is that okay? Hello, Eleanor?
Yeah, let's move on.
Move on anyway, because I may answer the question by the slides I've got in the next section. I'm going to talk a little bit about literature review, primarily because it came out top in our poll at the beginning. This is what everyone worries about, because people are told you've got to write a literature review, and it's never quite clear what is expected. One thing you can be sure of, that a literature review is not just an overview of what has been written. So you have got to be in there in some way. Your presence is required. It's like going into a room and joining in a debate that's already ongoing, but in which you can't just be a listener. You've got to be a participant. And we talk about this in chapter 4 of the book, is all about the literature review. We talk about this in detail. The first problem is the literature review is two things. It's the actual process by which you engage with the literature, but it's also the thing that you hand in. It's the product. So this can be confusing. And expectations may be very, very different, and literature reviews may vary across disciplines. So I do recommend chapter 4 of the book for this. I mean, you could go on writing forever on this, because there are lots and lots of variants to the literature review. Let's look at some of them. This is what a literature review does, in my mind. It helps you to put your research topic in some kind of context and compares it with other studies and relevant projects. And it tries out your research questions. So it's got to be related to your research questions and any hypothesis or claims you're making. It clarifies what your key concepts mean. And number 6, it helps to define your own position with regard to the literature. There is an optional number 5, because in your literature review, or as a separate literature review, you may need to write about your research methodology. And this is going to be a big question along the line. You know, do I need a separate chapter to talk about my research methodology? Do I need a separate literature review for that? But there are other variants on the literature review as products. And we could try this as a poll, actually. As far as you know, when you're talking about literature review, which of these do you need to produce? If you don't know, then you don't need to answer. But Eleanor, can we try that out as a poll and see how we get on? Because we haven't had a poll for a bit. We're getting a very, very interesting majority looking at a separate designated chapter. That's what I would expect at master's level, that we do have this separate chapter within the PhD thesis. But at PhD, it can be more complicated than this. Okay, that's very interesting, actually. And most interesting of all is that people have ignored number 5. So if we just go on and stop that, and you might want to consider what we mean by interim literature review, because this may be your first task. Very often in your first year of PhD study, your supervisors will want to see some evidence that your research is making progress, that you're reading in an organized way, and at the same time, they're in tenterhooks to see if you can write or not, because unless you've published a lot and shown the publications, they really want to know that you can do some writing. So this is often your first piece of writing, and that is why the interim literature review is so popular. Now, it's an interim review and an opportunity to clarify your stance in relation to other writers, but it may end up as a series of chapters or a series of chapter sections in the final version. The point is, it's not the same as the final literature review. So I think it's quite useful to start thinking about it as a kind of separate entity. Most people, in my experience, are asked to do an interim literature review, which is combined with an updated proposal. And that's probably going to be your first piece of serious writing. And across disciplines, I did a study of this. This is a very small extract. There's more in chapter 4. And I discovered that there's a lot of variation, even within disciplines, you know, whether to have a methodology literature review or not. And the types of literature reviews, these are different people I talk to, very, very much summarized. But you can see that some people have an interim literature review, some people don't. Some people have reviews spread over several chapters. The important thing for you is to find out what you have to do. So these are my tips for planning a successful literature review of whatever type. First of all, you have to remember the principles of effective reading. You've got to have some kind of system that works for text selection and rejection. You've got to have some way of leaving your tracks. You've got to have some way of recording what you've read through notes, preferably analytic notes, and you've got to be able to allocate time in an efficient way for that. So those go without saying. Those are reading essentials, whatever you're doing, but they also apply to the literature review. But you also need to ask yourself these questions, and if you don't know the answers, these are things you need to find out and ask others. So how many literature reviews will you need to produce while you're doing your doctoral research? So what types of review, you know, where will they be located? I mean, what chapters will you put them in? Above all, and there is variance in this, how strong can your voice be? Can you begin by saying, I will argue that? In some fields, it will be encouraged. In others, no, 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 you can't do this. Your own voice has to be a little bit more subtle. But no matter how you're advised on doing it, your own voice needs to be there. if you're just doing the views of other people, this to me is not a literature review. This is a literature overview. So that's something to really think about. How am I going to get a literature review with an angle? And how long and how should we structure? And, you know, probably because universities, particularly in the UK, are interested in targets and milestones, you've probably been giving some, you know, by week 9 of the first term, you'll need a plan and a structure. Then you'll give an oral presentation, and then you'll submit a review of the relevant literature. So those can be your goals set together with your supervisor. What if you fail to achieve your goals? Well, it's better than having no goals at all. And I often say this to people, you know, people say, I tried to do this and I failed. Much worse is just reading and writing aimlessly without targets. So when universities set you these little milestones, it's a good idea. We could also talk about software solutions. You might want to spend some time trading in things like EndNote or Zotero, even NVivo, which really is designed for QDA, qualitative data analysis. Many people use for text categorization, for literature reviews. So these are other things you can think about. But then think about the structure. And this maybe will answer the question about the order in which you write. The order in which you present a literature review, I think, should be something like this. That first of all, you do need an introduction with a kind of statement of intent. And it's got to link your literature review with the rest of what you're doing. So how it's going to relate to your research questions, for example. Most literature reviews are organized thematically or related to issues which are part of your research aims or questions. So there isn't any set order for this, just the themes which seem to you to be important. Or if you can't do that, you can follow the structure suggested by the kind of questions that you want to ask. But really important is to have a concluding section in which you pull everything together. So you can't just stop in the middle of nowhere. You do need a conclusion in which you say, what does all this mean? What conclusions can I draw, having looked at the views of other writers that are relevant to my research? So you do need a structure, and you do need to work on the structure. And I think this is a possible poll, but I'm not sure if we need to do this. Probably we won't do this as a poll. We've got other polls. But if you think about this, these are fundamental questions that you need to ask yourself. First of all, who you're writing for. Secondly, how much information can you take for granted? You've got to be really, really careful here. You may worry about patronizing your intelligent readers, but if there's something they know, they can always skip it. But if you leave out something essential that you assume they know, and they don't, then you're in trouble. So if in doubt, spell it out is my motto, I think. Or you can add it as a footnote, or you can refer to another part of your work. But make sure it's there if you think they might need it. People worry at this stage about lack of knowledge. I don't know enough. I will expose myself. I'll be exposed as a fraud. People don't expect you to have all the answers at this stage. What they do expect is that you're beginning to formulate the questions and you're beginning to focus your research so that it will aim towards an end which is going to be productive for people in your field. So we certainly don't expect the answers at this stage, particularly in an interim literature review. And then the big questions, how strong does your own presence need to be? I talk about this at length in the book in chapter 4, and I give some examples of very strong voice and not so strong voice. And a question, how can you build a coherent text that you'll feel satisfied with? Well, that's a big one. Structure is part of it, but it's not all. Once again, all I can do at this stage is to refer you to the book. Chapter 8 is all about coherence, clarity and coherence. These are two of the essentials of writing. So we whipped through that. I've just got a few things I want to say about motivation. Maybe, Eleanor, if you agree, I'll just go on and then we'll have questions at the end. I don't have so much more to say. Is that
Yes,
okay?
yeah, that's fine. I just wanted to acknowledge at this point that we have obviously gone over the advertised time.
Apologies.
And there's a few people who I know will have to go and leave and do other things now, but we will be sending around a recording at the end of the webinar, so don't fear.
Okay.
And also we will have some time for questions at the end for those who would like to stay around a bit longer. We will be able to run on.
Excellent. I've just got very little more to say, but what I have to say I think is really important. You've got to think about the task ahead, and you've got to think about writing not just as a technical exercise, but as a kind of psychological exercise as well. When people give up, it's not because they have technical problems, it's because they feel that they don't have something to say, or they're not confident in their work, or they can't respond to criticism. Part of the deal will be getting criticism and knowing how to respond to it. And above all, you've got to feel that this is your project. If you feel you've lost control, if you've lost ownership, then it's going to be a real problem. So once again, we don't need to do this as a poll, but which of these do you think is going to demotivate you? And they're all quite serious. Number one, I think affects all of us. But if we find that we're losing interest, we're losing control, we can't respond to negative criticism, then we need to talk to other people, because we're all in this situation. You know, all of us find it hard when we get negative feedback. You submit your article for publication and they say, sorry, we won't publish it. And your first reaction is rage and anger. How dare they? I worked so hard on this. But when you calm down and you read the feedback, you can learn from this. I mean, writing is a process in which we have to build in feedback. Feedback is absolutely crucial. We cannot write a PhD thesis without stopping to reflect and monitor and get feedback. And the way we read and the way we write also contributes to this. This little diagram looks very innocuous, but I firmly believe in this, that if you start reading and writing, and as you begin to produce quality in your reading and writing, so you begin to clarify your views. As you clarify your views, you develop your own stance and you get more confident and you gain ownership of what you're doing. And once you gain ownership, that feeds back into your reading and your writing. When you begin, generally, we are not confident in the outcome. We need to work towards this. Other people can help us, but we can help ourselves by starting on the task of reading and writing and developing an effective set of strategies for reading and writing at a very early stage. And I leave you with this because I've only had a chance to say a very little about this. I mean, in the book, there's a lot more thought. And for 15 years, I've been thinking about the enormity of producing such a big text. If you would like some further help, I would be very interested in doing other webinars on this topic and trying to make them a bit more interactive. So if you're interested in any of these topics, please do fill in the poll. And I think that's all I have to say on this topic. I'd just like to thank everybody and remind you that in the handout are my contact details, and I'd like to hear from you, whoever you are, whatever you're doing. I always like to hear to PhD students, and hopefully what I've got to say has not put you off, but will encourage you on this long journey. So thank you very much. I'll hand over to Eleanor now, because I'm sure there will be some questions.
Yes, I'm seeing lots of questions. One that kept coming up was about how much time people should spend reading.
That's a good one. I can answer that question, actually, because most people will say, how long is a piece of string? But I would say that exploratory reading, you need to spend the best part of a year. That's what I would expect. But if after 1 year you're still reading in exploratory mode, you have to rethink your strategy. You need to be focusing in a more, reading in a more focused way, certainly by the end of your first year of study. And if you're just reading and reading and reading, you can go on forever, because every time you read an article, it will lead to references which you can follow up, which will then lead to other articles. So I think after the best part of 1 year, you need to stop and you need to reflect and decide, where am I and where do I want to be? But actual volume of reading depends very much on your topic. I can't see myself for some reason. I've disappeared. Can you see me?
Maybe it might be a connection issue, but
Yeah.
never mind. We'll continue anyway.
Never mind. As long as you can see me, that's all right. Any other
Let
questions?
me just see if I can pick out any other questions. If you have a question now, just write it in the questions box.
Let's have a look to see. Yeah, I can't see questions.
So I've just had one here. I've been asked constantly by my supervisors to write up to the standards of doctoral level and more academically. Any tips on that, please?
Those are two different things, I think. Your supervisor hopefully is trying to set you a target to aim towards, because at the beginning of a doctoral program, very few people would expect you to write at the standard that will be demanded when you finish, because you've got 3 or 4 years to get up to that standard. So I hope what they mean is that they show that you have the potential to write a doctoral standard. If you can already write a doctoral standard, you don't need to do a PhD. The suitable style we haven't talked about today. This is something I would like to look at in a future webinar. Chapter 9 of the book is all about academic style. This is a whole subject for a webinar in its own right. I think it's difficult for most people to tune in to the kind of style which is acceptable for most academic articles. I mean, if you come straight from academic study, it's a little bit easier, but many people doing a PhD or another doctoral degree haven't studied for a long time. And I've known very, very good writers, for example, journalists and novelists, who find it very difficult to write in a suitable academic style. It's a question of thinking through the kind of expectations of readers. It's all about expectations of readers and how you're going to manage those. If you're going to write in a style that readers don't expect, you have to flag it up. Readers don't like to be surprised, and they will be confused if you write in a way which they don't expect. So it's a whole new subject area, really. You do have to think about style during first draft writing, but you do have an opportunity at the editing stage to go over the style. I mean, the biggest thing about style is that it should be consistent. You can't write in one style for one chapter and a more formal style in another chapter. It just doesn't look right. Okay, let's see if I can get my picture back. No, unfortunately. Any other questions? Oh, I've come back. Any other questions?
One question on how much reflection should be in a methodology chapter.
It depends, really. I mean, if you're using a very straightforward methodology, one that's immediately accepted by readers in your field, you probably don't need a methodology chapter. Just a section in the introductory chapter may be enough. But if you're using something which seems counterintuitive, I mean, I think of an example many times. When I was at University of London, I had a pharmacist in one of my classes, and he was collecting qualitative data. He was doing focus groups. He wanted to know why people wouldn't take their blood pressure tablets. So he needed interviews, and this was almost anathema for fellow pharmacists. They just weren't used to collecting data in this way. So he needed a very, very long chapter in which he justified his methods. So if anything is unusual, it's counterintuitive, then you do need a thorough examination. If it's something which is absolutely acceptable, normal to readers in your field, you may not even need a methodology chapter. You shouldn't think of the PhD thesis as like the master's, which is very prescribed. Chapter 1, introduction, chapter 2, literature review, chapter 3, methodology. It doesn't work like that. It will depend very much on what you're trying to do. So whether to have a methodology chapter or not is a decision you'll need to make towards the end of your first year when you're beginning to think about the structure of your PhD. Okay?
Okay, I'll just pick up another question here. What could be goals in the exploratory reading phase?
You could have several goals. I mean, the first thing is just to look at the range of material that's available around your topic. You may discover that no one's written anything, and then you have to rethink your topic. Another goal might be to find what kind of questions, if people are writing about this topic, what kind of questions are they asking? And to find out if you want to ask similar questions, so maybe you will find a research question in this way through your reading. Maybe you'll see someone who's asked a question and the answer in your view is not really adequate, so you'll want to ask the same question. Maybe you'll see a question that you want to transfer to a different context, to a different society. So there are several goals you can have, but your biggest goal, I think, is just to find out what's out there. Go away and read, as supervisors say.
Would you be up for answering one more question, Desmond?
Yeah, sure. No, I'm fine. Yeah. I can see myself now, which is easier.
So, do you have any recommendations on when to ask for external feedback from others other than your supervisor? At what stage could this be helpful?
I would say at every stage. And it depends what you mean by external feedback. I'm a very, very great believer in getting non-specialists to give feedback. So if I write a paper or a chapter, I'll turn to someone in my family and I'll say to them, can you see what I'm trying to say in this? And they'll say, this is all a load of nonsense. I don't understand this. And I'll say, just read it. And can you see the point I'm trying to make? And if they can see the point, then I know that it's reasonably clear. So there's feedback on that level. Specialized feedback, the answer depends a lot. I mean, some people now are doing what we call the by papers model, in which they will write papers which will be structured together in the doctoral thesis. So the first paper will get published in their first year, in which case they'll get an awful lot of external feedback, which can feed into the other papers. So it depends what kind of model of doctoral degree you're doing, really. The by papers model is becoming more and more common as more and more people want to get published. It does have this advantage. The disadvantage of the by papers model is that you may want to disown your first paper by the time you get to your third or fourth year. It sometimes happens. Any others?
Let me just have a look. Should one treat each chapter as a paper with its own research question and literature review?
If you're doing the by papers model, yes. If you're doing a monograph, the answer is no. So it depends how many studies are built into your research project. I mean, most of us will be doing a monograph, so everything will build up to the one study. And the hardest part is when you report and analyze your own data. And this is something we could have a separate webinar on, because this is the biggest thing you have to do. Today we're focused on the early stages, but the answer to that is it varies a lot.
Okay, thank you, Desmond. I'm not seeing many new questions, so I'm just going to switch back to my control now.
I say thank you, everybody.
So thank you everybody for attending, and thank you so much to Desmond. I think we'll all agree that was a really insightful webinar, and there were lots of comments to that effect in the chat box. So thanks everybody for attending. And if you found what Desmond was saying really interesting, I direct you to find out more about his book, the PhD Writing Handbook. There's a link there that you can click, which will lead you to our website. And there it is. I'd also direct you to our Palgrave Research Skills series, where you'll find similar titles. But thank you again to Desmond, and thank you so much for everybody for attending and contributing your questions.
Thank you, everybody.